Tantha Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Unique Hustle, My Drive to be the Best Car Customizer in Hip-Hop and Sports, by Will Castro with Mark Finkelpearl. Forward by DJ Khaled. Narrated by Will Castro. This is dedicated to my grandfather Bonifacio. He believed in me, kept me focused, and engraved in me my work ethic. I love you endlessly, Papi. Forward. This book is amazing. When I was coming up in the game, if you were into cars, flyness, and taking it to the next level, and you did not know Will Castro, you were going to hear about him soon. His work speaks very loudly. It inspires me. He's part of hip-hop culture. Just start with all the whips he did for Busta Rhymes. I remember once seeing an 18-wheeler filled with Busta's amazing cars, and they were all Will Castro builds. Eventually, Will and I connected through Fat Joe. All the cars that Will built for Joe thrilled me. Will started by putting rims on my Escalade. Then from there, we upgraded to foreign cars. We started getting into the Rolls-Royce world, the Bentley world, the Phantom world. And I found, as we were doing all of this together, that his customer service was unbelievable. He'll get on an airplane and fly to you just to have a conversation. Will Castro was born to pop up. Whether I have a car to work on or not, he's there with something to represent his brand. Will is hip-hop, and his customers are always satisfied. I don't even want to call them customers. They're more like his family, friends. And I know that for a fact that if I need Will, he'll come through for me and for his friends every time. Hip-hop people express their success in different ways. For me, I like to project happiness and how blessed I feel to have made it in the game. And sometimes we like to treat ourselves with a beautiful car. And what is more beautiful than a Rolls-Royce touched by Will Castro? What I love in my cars and what Will always gives me is a clean interior. Everything's got to be fly, the paint, the rims, the stereo. Sitting in a clean interior with a white t-shirt and jeans is like putting on a pair of brand new sneakers straight out the box. And that's the thing, Will knows our life. And so he knows the presentation we need inside these cars. Sometimes he gives us too much presentation, and then we have to do a million shows to keep up with what Will's bringing. But he's bringing it. There's nothing we can do to stop him. DJ Khaled, Miami, Florida. Preface. Writing this book wasn't all that easy for me. It brought up a lot of memories I would rather have forgotten. But I decided early on that if I was going to write down my life story, I had to do it openly and honestly. I had to be willing to look at what I've done wrong in my life and own it. And it hasn't all been terrible. In fact, so much of it has been so great. I had to write a book. Going through my life has brought back to mind phenomenal moments that I've not thought about in decades, especially of my childhood spent on the streets and in the projects of New York. I hope that if you get anything out of my life journey so far, it's something about persistence in the face of tough odds. It's about never, ever giving up, even when you're down on the mat and the ref is 2 slaps into the 3rd count. If you get up and you keep fighting, you'll never know what's around the corner. And just having a chance to get around the corner is a blessing from God. Keep going. You'll never get anywhere if you don't keep staring down that road, and just make sure you have some nice rims as you roll. Will Castro. Chapter 1. The End of the Beginning. It was a Sunday afternoon, just like any other, when the doorbell rang at my house in 2008. I got up to answer it, walking away from the football game on TV. The second that I opened that door, my life changed forever, and I would experience the darkest times I ever knew, and I had no idea yet. Before that doorbell went off, I was on the top of the world. I was living the American dream. I had a house, a wife, a fabulous daughter named Paige. We were living large. At home, I had a personal chef cooking for us every night. I had a hit TV show on Speed called Unique Whips and a new one on Spike TV. I had a star-studded celebrity client list that wanted me to customize car after car for them. My clients were like Busta Rhymes, Eric Sherman, P. Diddy, LeBron James, and Jeff Gordon. I even hung out with Donald Trump at the Trump Tower long before he won the presidency. Trump in my day was a New York businessman a lot of people admired. I was at the top of my game, I was successful and smart, and now I had to answer the door. When I did, I figured out fast how not successful and not smart I really was. 2 federal officers were on the other side, 1 man, 1 woman, dressed in dark suits. They had gold badges and guns. Seeing them was like getting hit by a Maybach on a reckless Sunday joyride. I immediately thought to myself, I got a problem. Do you mind if we talk in the house, Mr. Castro? I showed them into my spacious, comfortable home, past a huge saltwater fish tank, past a large screen TV, through the kitchen, and out to the landscape backyard, with a patio furniture and high-end gas grill. Looking back, I probably should have just walked out the front door, shut it behind me, talked to them on the porch, but it was too late for that. They were in my house, and they saw all the material things and creature comforts that we had. They wanted to talk about back taxes and the fact that I had not filed tax returns with the IRS in a few years. I replayed this day in my head thousands of times. They had me there. And why? I had not done what every American was supposed to do when they were making the kind of money I was. Giving Uncle Sam his fair share. I was naive, stupid, and dumb. It's that simple. You gotta understand, I was a kid from LaGuardia Public Projects on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Growing up in the 1970s and 80s, in my neighborhood, you made a buck, you kept the buck. That's it. Nobody thought about taxes. Everyone used cash. It's no excuse. I had a mom who worked very hard every day of her life in a dental practice. I had a stepdad who had a good job with Con Ed, the electrical company in New York. But when I struck gold with my business, I was thinking the way I learned to on the streets. My money is my money. Or more importantly, I was not thinking. I had a big business with lots of employees, and I paid them all cash at the end of the week. They appreciated that, and nobody ever asked me why I did it that way. I never went to business school, but I was a businessman. Nobody ever told me about Social Security, taxes, and withholdings. I was about to learn the hard way. The TV show Unique Whips didn't help me. The producers made me look like some kind of Tony Montana and OG I wasn't. And in the show I was doing for Spike TV didn't help either. And the fact is, I wasn't dirty. My business was legitimate. I just wasn't paying all the withholding taxes for my employees and the incoming money. And instead, I was supporting my lifestyle at home beyond my means. As federal agents sat in my pool house, asking me questions that I really didn't know how to answer, it was suddenly crashing down all around me. Before I knew it, I was going to have my lawyers telling me to choose from 3 different federal correction facilities, one of them in New Jersey, one in Alabama, and one in North Carolina. Prison. It looked very much like I was going to be heading there. But I'm getting ahead of the story, way ahead. Chapter 2. Lower East Side. Here's the thing. You got to have some kind of hustle, some kind of grind, some kind of drive to really survive in the streets of New York. You just have to. If you don't, it will eat you alive. You got to have grit to make it. Growing up as a kid in 1970s in New York City defines me. It was an experience that still reverberates in the man that I am today. I grew up in the Lower East Side, what's known as the LES for short. I lived in the LaGuardia houses, 13 public buildings built in the 1950s, made up of nearly 1,100 apartments. New York at the time was just like you see in the old movies from the period. I don't mean comedies like Plaza Suites and Annie Hall. I mean films like Superfly, Mean Streets, Shaft, Black Gun, and The French Connection that captured the dirt and the grit and the look and the feel of the city. But it was the people, the characters that made New York at the time so incredible. Today, with New York being as expensive as it is, the bohemians, the musicians, the artists, and the dope dealers have moved out. Back then, all the good and all the bad was smashed together. To a large extent, kids like us were on our own, and the city was our backyard and playground. You had to be home for dinner, and you had to listen when your mom called. But we were free-range kids. Parents did not helicopter the way they do today. And guys like me and my friends were not attached to cell phones all day and night. We could not be tracked, which made for some serious adventures. We were urban minority Tom Sawyer Huckleberry Finns, and the East River and New York Bay were our Mississippi. We came in contact with all the good and the bad and the ugly, and it formed us as people. It was incredible because it was so multicultural. We were immersed in the worlds of so many different people, so many walks of life. You had Chinatown, you had Little Italy, the Village, you had Katz's Deli. There was a large Jewish influence from the days of the Ellis Island immigration. By the time the 1950s and 60s rolled around, the LES was filled with Puerto Ricans, like my family, and folks from the Dominican Republic. You had it all. That's New York, and once you're a New Yorker, you're always going to be a New Yorker. You know you're special. I would never give up my childhood for anything. It was just amazing. Living down there, at the time, it was beautiful. There were rough areas, and there were some bad people too. An outsider coming into the Lower East Side would feel a little threatened and scared. However, if you were born and raised there, you felt like you were untouchable because you were so comfortable with your surroundings. In my neighborhood, I went to PS 137, and I grew up with all sorts of people. There was no racism there. None. We were all from the Lower East Side. We were all minorities. We were from public housing. We were all one, and we all went to the same Boy Scouts, Cub Scouts, PAL, football, OLS Little League, 10th Street Baseball Leagues, 7th Precinct Roadrunners football. The Roadrunners wore black and gold, just like the Pittsburgh Steelers. And that turned us to Steeler fans at a young age, just as they were becoming unstoppable Super Bowl champs. My father was William Castro Sr., and my mother was Minerva Capo Castro. They both came from Puerto Rico. My dad was from a tough neighborhood near Old San Juan called Santurce. That has the distinction of being the most densely populated neighborhood on the island. My pops influenced me a lot. I always looked up to my dad. He was athletic. Everyone respected him in the neighborhood. My dad was an ambulance driver for the health center, one that still exists to this day in New York. My father was the first person to expose me to the love of cars. He had a hot red Mustang. It was a 68 short window fastback automatic transmission with a black interior. That car was respected by the neighborhood. Everyone knew that was his ride. Beside the cars, he got me into the Yankees and took me to ball games on bat day. My parents got divorced when I was about 7, and my brother Bobby was just a baby. They just could not get along. My dad was a playboy, and he liked to have a good time. He was also hot-tempered. One of my main memories of his red Mustang is not a good one. I must have been 7 years old, and my parents had just recently split up. My mother was dating a man named Al at the time. Al and I had been out somewhere, and he brought me back home. As we were pulling up to the building, I saw my father's red Mustang parked there, and it alarmed me. I said, Al, I think that's my dad's car. You better just drop me off here. But Al told me not to worry about it. As we were walking toward the building, my father approached. He said hello to me, and he told me to go to the apartment to my mom. He and Al were going to talk for a while. Well, my dad ended up beating him up pretty bad. Al went to the hospital. I'll never forget it. I think the bad aspects of my parents' relationship had an effect on me and my brother down the road, because you try to be a better person, a better father. I tried to be better in my first marriage with my wife Marilyn and my daughter Paige. I think that divorce is a bad thing, and at the end of the day, it's the children who are most hurt. So my dad and my mom didn't see eye to eye, and he wanted to remarry a woman named Naomi. My mom was hurt by that. I know how much she loved them, and it was hard to see her struggles. She became a single parent. She worked hard doing odd jobs to put food on mine and Bobby's plates. Not once did she ever go on welfare. Her main career was a dental assistant, and later on she became a dental supervisor. She was employed by the city of New York and worked for 38 years before she retired and moved to Florida. My father was still around after the divorce. He lived uptown in Spanish Harlem. He would pick me up on the weekends. He and Naomi had a steady relationship, and they wound up getting married and having kids together, my brother Chris and my sisters Neri and Dawn. I did not see my dad every day, but there was a man in my life who was usually important. That was my mom's dad, Papi. His name was Bonifacio Martinez. Papi was a merchant marine. Then he worked at the courts on Chambers Street at City Hall. He was very into politics. He was always dressed to the nines in a suit. He was a very proud Puerto Rican. At the courthouse, he was a court officer and a file clerk. He took the job super serious. He lived with us in the projects. Every year, he took me to Puerto Rico, connecting me forever to my ancestral home. Papi was there through thick and thin. In my youth, I also developed a faith in God, and I believe God was there too. I'm not very religious. I don't go to church every Sunday, but I do believe that God acts in my life, and I pray a lot. I've needed to. Through it all, life in the LES was still fun and amazing. My best friend was Kenny Williams, and we were inseparable from grade school through high school. Kenny lived on the second floor while I lived on the ninth floor at the LaGuardia housing. It all began with a fight outside the building. There were bullies all around, and I was short, small kid. I got bullied a lot, and because of it, I used to try to duck into the back door of the building to avoid any mess with the kids, always congregating out front. One time, I was walking in with my mom and said, "Mom, I'll go around the back." She said, "What for?" I told her I didn't mind going to the back door. It was okay. But she soon realized that I was being bullied, and by one kid in particular, Kenny Williams. Well, my mom decided to call up Kenny's mother, Hattie, and she said, "Hattie, your son is bullying my son. They're going to go outside and fight right now, and this is going to end today." I said, "Ma, I don't want to fight, don't want to fight." She said, "No, your ass is going downstairs, and we're going to settle this once and for all. You're not going to be going through no back of a building." And sure enough, me and Kenny got into it in the front of the building. And after that, we became the best of friends, inseparable to the point that years later, in adolescence, when girlfriends were involved, he would always find a way to mess things up between me and the girl. I write this with a big smile on my face. It's just that we were blood brothers. We played football together, baseball, bike riding, AFX cars. We were so in competition with one another growing up. It was unbelievable. Boxing, karate, you name it, we did it all. New York City was our backyard. We had those 1970 bikes with the banana seats. Kenny's was a Schwinn orange crate, and I had the green Schwinn sweet pea. He always had the better bike. And we'd explore the city on the backs of those. At about 11 years old, I remember getting onto the FDR Drive at Grand Street and heading north all the way to the Bronx, like 155th Street. We'll see the Yankee Stadium there, but we never went to the ball games. We'll just eat a cheese sandwich or some snacks like that and turn around and head home. It was a true adventure. We'll head downtown too, all the way to Battery Park. No parents. The city was wide open to us. We saw a lot. Kenny and I watched the Twin Towers being built. I remember construction everywhere, putting up those incredible works of art. Later, we watched them film King Kong there, and I had clear memories of the giant gorilla laying on his back in the plaza of the World Trade Center, its huge hand facing palm up and wide open. Kenny and I also did crazy stuff like you hear about the kids in the 1970s doing. We played Evel Knievel. With our bikes, we used to make ramps and light fires inside cans. We would set up 3 garbage cans, then hurtle all the way from the end of the block and ride up the ramp and jump them. And then we would add a 4th garbage can. Guys always got hurt. Man, some guys couldn't jump the ramp. They used to do backflips, all kinds of crazy stuff. In Manhattan, right there in the projects, they had 4-foot chain-link fences, so kids would build ramps to jump those. We used to do crazy things just beating up on our bikes. Crazy shit. We used to swing off flagpole ropes. I mean, just some wild stuff that kids would do. We also went to work early. There was a famous Broadway play called Newsies, and me and Kenny were newsies like that, just the 1970 version. We sold the New York Post. We said one thing on repeat: get your post here, get your post here. You had to be aggressive just to make a couple of dollars. But it started one thing in me, very young, reading the newspaper. The news, of course, but especially the sports section. The back page had the standings, and I started learning about averages and winning percentages and how the Yankees were doing. You know, what's a clincher? When you clinch the title or if you clinch the division. The Yankees were a big part of New York culture there. Selling newspapers also showed me the joys of making money and having some bills in your pocket. This was a period in time when cars were becoming very important to me, and Kenny had a huge influence on me in that regard. I think if it wasn't for him, I would have not been into cars. That's the truth. It began when we were kids, playing with AFX cars, laying down the track and racing. Later on, we got older. Kenny was the first one of us to get a car, a Plymouth Satellite Sebring. I was in love with that car. Kenny brought me around to his uncle's garage, where he used to park cars, and then I became a valet parker at Mario's restaurant. I just did a lot of those things that Kenny used to do. I used to definitely look up to him, like he was a bigger brother, but he was only maybe a year older than me. But this era was later. Once again, I'm getting ahead of the story. Chapter 3. Strong Island. When I turned about 14 years old, my mother decided to move us to Brentwood, Long Island. She felt New York City was changing, so she wanted to get out of the projects and wanted me and my little brother Bobby, 7 years younger, to have some space and get into better schools. This was the early 1980s, and things were changing in the city. Money was getting more prominent. The rich were taking over. Brentwood is a working-class town in the middle of the island, not far from Islip. Today, there's a big Hispanic community there and lots of African Americans too, and also whites. It was a rough transition for me to move, and it took me a couple of years to fully adjust. First of all, the kids in the school fought a lot. The races did not get along. I was perplexed by this. There was no racism in the projects of the LES. Everybody was a minority. But in Brentwood, we're supposed to be going to a good school in a good neighborhood. Yet, it turned out that Brentwood was crazier than New York. The famous TV miniseries, Roots, was out on television at the time. So young teenagers' sense of racial identity was heightened by that. That show emerged at the time when the whole country shared the same television culture, and it had a huge impact. I said to my mom, "You got to be kidding me. Mom, you told me this was going to be cool environment." There was truly a divide, and I wasn't about that. For the first time in my life, I really woke to the differences in race and class in New York. Eventually, one adjusts to a new school with new attitudes, and the way you do so is by earning your stripes. You stand up to racism by not tolerating it. Around me, I said, "Don't do that. You don't treat anyone differently." And I had to tell people that I wouldn't tolerate the N-word being used or anything else of a derogatory nature, because that's not what we're about on the Lower East Side. It was never about that. I had to get adjusted. It took a long time. Years, in fact. My friends had to come see me from the city. They met my mom at Gouverneur Hospital, where she worked, and they would drive out with her to Long Island every Friday. They made the transition a little easier for me. I didn't want to live there. I just didn't. Because, living in the city was totally different from living in the suburbs. It really was. Down in the LES, you could come out of your building, you would see thousands of people living in one house. You could see your friends downstairs. We had so many parks you could walk to, bike to. On Long Island, you have to have a car to get everywhere. I also had an added burden of being a city kid, an outsider, not a native to the island. That played both ways, because the suburbia kids looked to guys like me for their sense of style. We had the flyest kicks, bomber jackets, baseball hats, fly jeans. We were from the city, and our swagger was different that way. I had the fly wearers, and I had a burgundy sheepskin with a crown with the 69ers to match. I had suede Pumas. As the fashions came out, that was what it was in the city. It was all about that, because you had to have status if you were coming out of your building. You had to have the right kicks. You had to have the right jeans. You had to have the right bomber. If the goose down was out, you had to have that too. And my grandfather made sure I had everything I pretty much wanted. I brought this sense of fashion to Long Island. I also brought music. It was me and kids like me who had Grandmaster Flash tapes, Busy Bee tapes, and the suburban kids wanted all that stuff. I began playing sports as a young kid in LES. I took karate with Kenny, Little League, things like that. And so when I hit Brentwood, I continued to play football, baseball. This kept my mind off the transition, the fact that Long Island really didn't feel like home at first. That was good. What was bad was that my mom still worked in the city, so I felt badly about her commute and how hard she had to work. She knew this. My mom had to work, while a lot of the other parents, including many stay-at-home moms, would drop off their kids at practice and go to games. My mom couldn't do that. My dad couldn't do that. My grandfather couldn't do that. So I didn't have that support. My parents were working. They couldn't come to games. Later on in life, when I had my first child, Paige, I tried to do things differently. I went to her track meets and her cheerleading competitions, but I understood my mom's position. I understood she had to work. I would get on her sometimes saying things like, "Oh, Tippy's mom was at practice." My mother said, "Let me break it down to you. I work." In high school, I was 15. I met Marilyn, the woman who would become my first wife and the mother of my first child, Paige. Marilyn showed me what suburban life was. If it was not for our relationship, I may have not ever gotten into the car business in the way I did. We met at Bayshore Roller Rink. Most of us were still too young to drive, so all the parents would drop us off there. Now, for some of you young people reading this, you may not know what a roller rink is, but in the 70s and 80s, These were places of great entertainment for teenagers.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?